Clinical data shows a person who becomes paralyzed is 3 times more likely to fall into a deep depression. For one reclusive millionaire, that statistic became a prison sentence, as every single professional caregiver he hired walked away. Until the day his nanny's 4-year-old daughter did something no expert ever could. His name was Ashford Crane, a self-made millionaire who lost the use of his legs in a single moment and then slowly lost everyone else. Her name was Laura Chin, a single mother and his housekeeper, fighting to keep a roof over her daughter's head. They lived under the same massive roof, moving in silent, separate orbits, until Laura's little girl, Lena, saw a closed door and decided to open it. The room was completely silent, not the silence of peace, but the heavy quiet of a life holding its breath. Ashford Crane sat in his wheelchair by the tall window he'd stared through every morning for 2 years, his hands frozen in his lap. And then the door creaked open without a knock, breaking the first of 37 house rules. It was just the soft padding of tiny, bare feet on hardwood. Ashford didn't turn. His shoulders climbed half an inch toward his ears. Then a small, round voice, no more than 4 years old and completely fearless, said, "You sad?" The question hung in the air like something fragile. Ashford's hands, which had been deliberately still, trembled once, just once. He couldn't answer. The little girl didn't wait. She walked around the side of the wheelchair, dragged her worn, stuffed rabbit, and without hesitation, climbed onto the footrest. She grabbed his frozen hand in both of hers and just held it. And Ashford Crane, the man who had built a $4.2 million tech firm from nothing, who had fired 12 caregivers in 22 months, who had not cried once since the accident, felt something in his chest crack open like old wood in the cold. How did a 4-year-old do in 30 seconds what teams of professionals could not do in 2 years? That's the question. But first, you need to understand what this house felt like before she walked into it. Nobody wanted the job. That's not an exaggeration. The high-end staffing agency that managed Ashford's care had placed him on their internal red list. Code for difficult client, unpredictable environment, guaranteed turnover, 12 caregivers in 22 months. One lasted 3 weeks. Another, a seasoned professional with 18 years of experience, walked out on her second morning without a word, left her badge on the kitchen counter, and never called back. The house itself seemed to exhale something cold. Even in summer, when the gardens outside were bursting, the inside of the Crane estate felt like a place where warmth came to die. The rules were posted on a laminated sheet outside his study door. 37 of them. No music, no rearranging items, no speaking to him in a slow, soft voice. Every hired professional memorized them, followed them, until they couldn't, until they quit. And yet Laura Chin showed up with a mop bucket and a sleeping toddler strapped to her chest. She had no other option. Her babysitter had cancelled that morning, the 3rd time in 2 weeks, and she could not afford to miss a single shift. So she did what single mothers have done since the beginning of time. She figured it out. She brought Lena. She would keep her in the supply closet turned break room near the kitchen. She would handle it. She always handled it. She did not know on that first morning that her 4-year-old would change everything. That a little girl with a stuffed rabbit and no concept of fear would walk through a closed door and do the impossible. But we're getting ahead, because before that moment, there were 2 very lonely people living under the same roof, moving in separate, silent orbits, never once truly seeing each other. That's where this story really begins. Laura's alarm went off at 4:47 every morning. Not 4:45, not 5, 4:47. That was exactly how much time she needed. 14 minutes to get dressed without waking Lena, 6 minutes to make a bottle and pack the diaper bag, 12 minutes to drive to the estate if she hit every light green, which she never did. She lived inside that margin every single day. The apartment she rented was a 1-bedroom that always smelled of someone else's cooking. She slept on the pull-out sofa so Lena could have the bedroom. The mattress had a spring that dug into her left shoulder blade. She stopped noticing it 3 months ago, which she knew was not a good sign. She didn't talk about being tired. There was no one to tell. Lena's father had been gone since before she was born, not dead, just gone, the kind of gone that leaves no forwarding address. Laura had spent 2 weeks being angry, then she stopped, because anger costs energy and energy was the one thing she could not afford to waste. She cleaned houses for a living, had since she was 19, she was good at it, thorough, quiet, invisible. The Crane estate was her largest account. It paid 3 times what her other jobs paid. That and her own stubbornness were the only reasons she was still there after 2 months. She cleaned the East Wing on Mondays and Thursdays, the West Wing on Tuesdays and Fridays. She did not clean the study, that was on the laminated list. She saw Ashford rarely. Sometimes she heard the soft electric hum of his wheelchair in the hall. She would step aside, keep her eyes down, keep moving. He never spoke to her. She never spoke to him. That was the arrangement. On the other side of the house, Ashford Crane existed. That's the only honest word for it. He didn't live. He existed. He moved through the rooms of his own home like a man walking through a museum of his former life, observing everything, touching nothing. He had been paralyzed from the waist down for 2 years and 3 months. The accident was a car crash on a Tuesday evening in November, an ordinary Tuesday that gave no warning before it split a life in two. A truck ran a red light, that was all. And the version of Ashford Crane who could walk, who could run, who had built an empire, that version was simply gone. The new version was quieter, colder. He had fired his first caregiver for hovering, his second for speaking to him like a child, his third for moving a pen on his desk. The reasons got smaller as the months passed. He knew, on some clinical level, that he was pushing people away before they could leave on their own. He could not seem to stop. He had not seen a friend in over a year. He told himself this was by choice. He sat by the window every morning with a cup of coffee that went cold while he stared at the garden. He had planted 3 of the rose bushes himself, years ago, before he thought such things needed remembering. He did not go outside anymore. Some mornings, the silence in the house was so complete he could hear the hum of the refrigerator from 2 rooms away. He noted this fact with the same distant precision he now used to catalogue everything, like data points in a life he was observing, not living. On a Wednesday morning in late March, Laura arrived at 6:02, 2 minutes late, a green light she'd miscounted. Ashford heard her key in the lock from down the hall. He said nothing. He wrapped his hands around his cold coffee and stared at the garden. The silence resumed, 2 parallel lines that would never meet. That was the day Lena woke up early. Lena was 4 years and 2 months old, and she approached the world with the complete confidence of someone who had never been told most of it was off limits. She had dark curly hair that resisted every attempt to contain it. She carried a stuffed rabbit named simply Rabbit. She spoke in short, certain sentences and expected to be understood. She was not afraid of strangers. She was not afraid of quiet. She was not, as it turned out, afraid of Ashford Crane. The first time she saw him, she was supposed to be asleep on a folded blanket in the break room, but Lena had never been much for supposed to. She pushed the door open and wandered down the east hallway in her socks, dragging Rabbit by one ear. She found Ashford in the sunroom. He was holding a book. She walked right up to his wheelchair and stared. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at the wheel. Ashford looked at her over the top of his book. His face was that of a man who had not been spoken to by a child in a very long time. "A wheelchair," he said finally. She nodded as if this confirmed a suspicion. Then she climbed up onto the ottoman next to him without asking and sat there, looking out the same window. They sat like that for 4 minutes. Laura found her on the 5th and scooped her up with a flood of whispered apologies, her face flushed red. Ashford said nothing. He looked back at his book. But that evening, for the first time in months, his coffee didn't go cold. The second time happened 3 days later. Laura had brought Lena again. The babysitter situation had not improved. This time, Lena made it all the way to the study door before Laura caught her. She stood in the hallway, peering at the closed door. "Man in there?" she asked. "Yes," Laura whispered, "but we don't go in there, come on." "He's sad?" Lena asked. Laura paused. She looked at the closed door. She didn't know how to answer that. "Come on, baby," she said, but the question stayed with her the rest of the day. The third time was the morning that changed the shape of everything. The morning she walked in without knocking. The morning she asked her question and held his hand. The morning something cracked. But here is the turning point almost no one saw coming. The moment that set everything in motion wasn't the hand-holding. It was what happened the very next day when the staffing agency sent a letter. A letter that would force Laura to make a choice that risked everything she had left. The letter was on the kitchen counter, propped against the fruit bowl where Laura couldn't miss it. It was from the staffing agency, addressed to Ashford. But Mrs. Patton, the estate's cook, who had worked there for 19 years, had already opened it, read it, and left it for Laura to see. The language was formal, professional, but the meaning was a sledgehammer. The agency was withdrawing from the account, effective immediately. The liability had become untenable. The turnover rate was unacceptable. They wished Mr. Crane well in finding alternative support. Laura read it twice. She set it back against the bowl. She stood in the kitchen, looking out the window at the garden, at the rose bushes he never visited, at the stone bench she'd never approached. She thought about her rent, about the spring in the sofa mattress, about Lena's shoes, which were already a size too small and had been for 3 weeks. She thought about the 4-year-old who had held a paralyzed man's hand the day before. Then she picked up her mop and started her route. She didn't tell him she'd seen the letter. She didn't have to. By Thursday, a new layer of quiet had settled over the house, a stiffness, like ice forming over water that was already cold. Mrs. Patton moved carefully in the kitchen. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, more accusatory. Ashford said nothing to anyone, but on Friday morning, Laura arrived to find his dinner tray from the previous evening still sitting outside the study door, untouched. The food was cold, congealed. She looked at the tray. She looked at the closed door. She knocked. No response. She knocked again, firmer. "Mr. Crane, I'm going to take the tray." Silence. She picked it up. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. That afternoon, Lena escaped the break room again, and this time Laura let her. The next 2 weeks were a slow, silent unraveling. Without the agency, the machinery of Ashford's care ground to a halt. His doctor, a careful man named Reyes who had been his physician for 6 years, came by unannounced on a Monday. Laura, cleaning the hallway, heard the conversation through the kitchen wall. The words were clear. Isolation, deterioration, cannot continue like this. Dr. Reyes left a list of in-home care facilities on the counter. Mrs. Patton sighed and left it next to the fruit bowl. Neither of them said anything to Ashford. Neither of them knew how. Laura started arriving earlier. She told herself it was about the route, more time to clean thoroughly before Lena woke up. That was true, but she also started leaving a fresh cup of coffee outside the study door every morning, not because anyone asked, because she knew Mrs. Patton's knees hurt at dawn, and because she knew the coffee would otherwise sit and go cold, a silent testament to another lost day. She didn't knock, she didn't announce it, she just left it there. The first morning, it was still there, full and cold, when she came back past at 9. The second morning, it was gone. She didn't let herself think too much about that. Lena, meanwhile, was building a world of her own. She had developed a full, independent relationship with Ashford that operated entirely outside of Laura's knowledge or control. She visited him in the mornings while Laura was in the West Wing. She had learned, somehow, that she needed to be quiet in the hallway. She crept along the wall in her socks with theatrical seriousness, a diplomat on a mission. She always brought an offering, a cracker from her snack, a flower pulled from the foyer arrangement, a piece of tape she'd found on the floor and considered precious. One morning, she brought him a bandage. She'd found it in a bathroom cabinet, the children's kind, with cartoon stars on it. She pressed it carefully onto the back of his hand with both palms, smoothing it down firmly, just like Laura did for her scrapes. "There," she said, "all better." Ashford looked at the cartoon bandage on his hand for a very long time. "Thank you, Lena," he said. It was the first time he had said her name. She beamed at him with her whole face, then ran back down the hallway. He sat with that bandage on his hand for the rest of the day and did not take it off. But outside that small, quiet room, the pressure was building. Laura overheard a phone call. Ashford's attorney, a man with a sharp voice, was on the speaker. "Ashford, the board is asking questions. You haven't been on a call in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. If you do..." She moved away quickly, kept her head down, but her stomach was tight for the rest of the afternoon. That evening she sat on her sofa mattress, the spring digging into her shoulder, and looked at her phone, at her bank balance, at the number that was never enough. She thought about what it would mean to lose this job. She thought about Lena, asleep in the next room, hugging Rabbit. She didn't sleep. It was Mrs. Patton who finally said the quiet part out loud. On a Thursday morning, she set a plate of toast on the kitchen table, sat down across from Laura, and said, "He asked about the little one." Laura looked up. "Asked me her name, how old she was." Mrs. Patton picked up her tea. "He's never asked about staff before, not once in 19 years. Laura didn't know what to say. "I'm just telling you," Mrs. Patton said, and she drank her tea. That same afternoon, Laura was mopping the east hallway when she heard it. Laughter. Not a lot of it, not loud. A short, low sound that was quickly swallowed, the kind that escapes before a person can catch it. She stopped mopping, stood completely still. From inside the study, Lena's voice, telling a story about Rabbit and a dragon and some crackers. And then again, that brief, low sound. Ashford Crane was laughing. Laura pressed her back against the wall. She stayed there for a full minute, eyes closed. Something was happening, something she didn't understand and hadn't authorized. Then came the morning. The study door was open, all the way open, not 3 inches. Ashford was at his desk, actually at his desk, not at the window. Papers were spread out in front of him. He was working. He looked up when she came around the corner. They looked at each other. "Good morning," he said. Laura blinked. "Good morning, Mr. Crane." He looked back at his papers. She continued down the hall, turned the corner, and stood against the wall with her hand over her mouth for 10 full seconds before she could keep moving. A fragile, impossible hope began to flicker, but this is where the story twists, because the very forces that were being healed inside that house were creating a dangerous vulnerability outside of it. Laura was crossing lines, professional, personal, emotional lines she could never uncross, and she was about to discover a secret that would make walking away impossible. She found the photograph by accident the following week. She was cleaning the hallway shelf, the long one near the east staircase that nobody used. She moved a small ceramic bowl to dust beneath it, and underneath, hidden, was a photograph that must have slid off the shelf months ago. A wedding photo. Ashford, younger by 5 years, standing straight and tall, and laughing, actually laughing with his whole face, beside a woman in a white dress. The woman was beautiful, dark hair, bright eyes, one hand on Ashford's chest, as if steadying herself from laughter. Laura set the photograph back exactly where she'd found it, under the bowl. She told no one, but she thought about that laughing version of him for the rest of the week. She thought about the canyon between the man in that photo and the man by the window. She mentioned it once, carefully, to Mrs. Patton. The cook didn't look up from her cutting board. "Her name was Claire," Mrs. Patton said. "She died 14 months before the accident." Laura stood very still. "Cancer," Mrs. Patton added, 19 months from diagnosis to end. He was with her every day." She said nothing else. She kept cutting vegetables. The conversation was over. That night, putting Lena to bed, Laura held her daughter a few seconds longer than usual. Lena, half asleep, patted Laura's cheek. "Mama tired," she murmured. "A little," Laura whispered. "Es okay," Lena sighed. "I'm here." The pieces clicked into place with a terrible, silent clarity. The garden he never visited. Claire had designed it, Mrs. Patton told her one morning without being asked. The stone bench with the small plaque. The way he always sat angled slightly away from the window, not fully facing the garden, but never fully turning his back on it either. He was not simply a difficult, paralyzed millionaire. He was a widower, a man who had lost his wife to a brutal disease, and then, before he could even learn how to grieve, had lost the use of his legs on an ordinary Tuesday. He hadn't just run out of patience. He had run out of ways to carry the weight. Laura understood, on a cellular level, what it meant to carry more than you had the hands for. She did not say this to him. She would not have known how. But she stopped looking at the floor when she passed him in the hallway. It was a small thing. It was everything. And then on a Tuesday, of course it was a Tuesday, the second letter arrived. This one was not from the agency. It was from the property management company that owned Laura's apartment building. A notice of rent increase, effective next month. An increase that would push her monthly expenses beyond what her jobs, even the Crane estate job, could cover. She read the notice in her car in the estate driveway after her shift. The numbers swam on the page. She calculated and recalculated. There was no margin left. The spring in the sofa mattress, Lena's 2 small shoes, the counted minutes of her morning routine, it was all a house of cards, and this was the wind. She had a choice now, a real one. She could start looking for another job, another apartment, quietly plan her exit from this house and its impossible, heartbreaking dynamics. Or she could do the unthinkable. She could step out of her role as the invisible housekeeper and into the chaotic, unprotected space of his care, not as a professional, but as a person who finally understood. She sat in her car for a long time, watching the light fade from the windows of the big, silent house. She knew, with a cold certainty, that if she walked away now, whatever fragile progress had been made would shatter. The coffee would go cold again. The door would close. The silence would return, deeper and more final than before. But stepping forward meant risking the only stable income she had. It meant tying her survival and her daughter's survival to the emotional state of a man who had driven away every expert sent to help him. It was the worst kind of gamble. She started the car. She didn't have an answer, but the clock was now ticking loudly in her ears. And the very next morning, fate forced her hand in a way she never could have predicted. Laura arrived the next morning to find Lena already in the garden. Not in the break room, not in the hallway, outside. And Ashford was out there with her. His wheelchair was on the garden path for the first time in over a year. They were both staring at the stone bench, and the small plaque Lena could not read. Laura stopped at the garden door, her hand frozen on the handle. She didn't go out. She didn't call Lena's name. She watched from behind the glass and held her breath. The March air was still cold. Lena's breath made little clouds. She stood beside his wheelchair, rabbit dangling from one hand. She looked at the bench. She looked at him. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing at the plaque. Ashford was quiet for a long time, long enough that an adult would have filled the silence, changed the subject, moved on. Lena waited. "Her name was Claire," he said finally. His voice was careful, each word placed like a weight on a fragile scale. "She sleep there?" Lena asked. "No," Ashford said. "She just liked the spot, so I put her name here." Lena nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone receiving important information. Then she asked the question, the one no therapist, no friend, no doctor had dared to ask in 2 years. It came out clean, direct, and utterly without armor. "You miss her?" Ashford's breath caught. There was no boardroom answer for this, no attorney's language, no way to fold it up and set it aside. He looked at this 4-year-old in her mismatched socks, one green, one white, and the dam he had built around himself for years simply crumbled. "Every day," he whispered. Lena reached up. She took his hand in both of hers, just like she had in the study. She held it. "Es okay," she said softly. "I'm here." And Ashford Crane, who had fired 12 caregivers, who had not cried since the accident, put his other hand on top of Lena's small ones. He pressed his eyes closed. His whole body shook once, quietly, like a tree in a wind you can barely feel. Behind the glass, Laura covered her mouth. She was crying before she realized it. Silent tears that just came. She didn't go out. This moment was not hers to enter. It belonged to a little girl with a stuffed rabbit and no understanding of impossibility, who had walked into a closed-off life and simply refused to leave it closed. They stayed like that for a long time. The man in the wheelchair and the toddler holding his hand beside the bench with a name on it, in the garden he had abandoned. When they finally came inside, something had shifted. It was in the air. Laura felt it as she went about her work. The house didn't just feel quiet, it felt still, a different kind of stillness. That evening, for the first time, Ashford did not eat his dinner on a tray in the study. He ate at the dining room table, the actual table. Mrs. Patton, without a word, set 3 places. Lena climbed into the chair to Ashford's left because she decided it was hers. She ate half a piece of toast and fed the other half to Rabbit, who she propped against a water glass. Ashford watched this solemn ritual with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was no longer a frown. The garden door was left unlocked the next morning. Laura noticed it on her way in. The handle was unlatched. The curtains on the garden-facing windows had been pulled back just enough to let the light in. She didn't mention it. She just cleaned around the extra light. The papers on Ashford's desk, which had been static for months, started having answers on them, notes in the margins. Laura could see them through the open study door, the door that was now consistently left open. She heard him on the phone once, his voice not just answering, but talking, arguing even. The sound of a human voice engaging in that silent room felt like a miracle. Dr. Reyes visited on a Friday for his monthly checkup. He came out of the study looking puzzled. He stopped Laura in the hallway. "What changed?" he asked, genuinely confused. Laura thought for a moment. "Ask Lena," she said. But this fragile new equilibrium existed in a bubble. Outside the walls of the estate, Laura's real-world problems were reaching a boiling point. The rent increase notice was a time bomb. She had 2 weeks before the new rate kicked in. She spent her evenings after Lena was asleep searching for other jobs, other apartments. Nothing added up. Nothing paid enough. She was trapped. To leave would shatter the delicate progress in the house and likely cost her the best reference she had. To stay meant financial ruin. She was living on borrowed time, and the interest was about to come due. Then a new variable entered the equation. A man in a sleek car pulled into the estate driveway one afternoon. Marcus Webb, Ashford's attorney. He wasn't scheduled. Laura saw him from the window, his face tight with purpose as he marched to the front door. This wasn't a social call. Mrs. Patton intercepted him in the foyer. Laura, dusting the staircase, couldn't help but overhear. "He's not taking calls, Marcus," Mrs. Patton said, her voice firm. "This isn't a call, Alina," Webb replied. "This is an intervention. The board is voting next week. If he doesn't show up, even by video, they're going to appoint an interim CEO. They think he's incapacitated. I need to see him." The word hung in the air. Incapacitated. A legal and financial death sentence. "He's in the garden," Mrs. Patton said quietly. Webb blinked, surprised. "The garden?" "Yes, with the child." Laura watched from the shadows as Webb walked to the garden door, paused, and looked out. She saw his posture change. The aggressive certainty drained from his shoulders. He watched for a full minute, then turned and walked back through the house without saying another word. He left without seeing Ashford at all. But the threat he brought did not leave with him. It now had a shape, a date, 1 week. If Ashford did not re-engage with his company, he would lose it. And if he lost it, the estate, the staff, the fragile ecosystem that included Laura and Lena, all of it would unravel. Laura understood the stakes now. It wasn't just about a man's sadness. It was about his entire world, and by extension, hers. The pressure was no longer emotional. It was existential. That night she made a decision. She would not ask for a raise. She would not mention her rent. Instead, she would do the one thing she had never allowed herself to do. She would involve herself, not as a housekeeper, but as a witness, as a person who saw the whole board. The next morning, she didn't just leave the coffee outside the study. She brought 2 cups to the dining table where Ashford now sat each morning. She put one at his seat and one at the opposite end of the long table. Then she sat down. She didn't speak. She just drank her coffee, looking out at the garden. After a minute, she heard the soft hum of his wheelchair approaching. He came into the room, saw her, and paused. Then he moved to the head of the table. He picked up his cup. They drank in silence for several minutes. "The board is voting next Thursday," he said suddenly, not looking at her. Laura's heart hammered. "I heard," she said softly. "Webb thinks I should fight." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure what's left to fight for." It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. Laura chose her words like stepping on stones across a river. "Lena thinks you're the man who fixes things," she said. "She told me," she said, "Ash fixes the big computer. She sees you working." Ashford looked down at his coffee. His jaw was tight. That man is gone. Is he? Laura asked. The question was gentle, but it hung in the air. She didn't wait for an answer. She stood, took her cup, and went back to work. But the seed was planted. Over the next 2 days, she saw him fighting, a different kind of fight, not against caregivers, but against himself. He spent hours in his study with the door open, on calls, his voice slowly regaining its old cadence. He was rusty, angry, frustrated, but he was trying. The house held its breath. Laura's rent deadline was now 5 days away. The board vote was in 4, 2 clocks, ticking in terrible unison. Then, on the eve of the vote, the worst possible thing happened. Lena spiked a fever, a high, sudden fever that left her listless and crying. Laura called out of work for the first time in over a year. She spent the night on the floor by Lena's bed, wiping her brow, her own anxiety a tight knot in her chest. Without the crane job, she couldn't afford a doctor. Without Lena being well, she couldn't go to work. It was a perfect, terrible trap. And as the sun rose on the morning of the board vote, Laura knew the delicate world they had built was about to be tested in the hardest way possible. Not by lawyers or boards, but by the simple, vulnerable need of a sick child. And the choice one man would have to make when he discovered the person who had quietly been holding his world together was now the one who needed help. At 8:45 on the morning of the board vote, Ashford Crane sat at his desk, dressed in a shirt and tie for the first time in over a year. The video conference was live on his screen, 12 faces of his board members waiting in little boxes. But his attention was not on them. It was on the empty chair at the dining table and the unanswered phone call to a housekeeper who had never once missed a day of work. He had called Laura's number twice. No answer. Mrs. Patton had only shaken her head when he'd asked, her expression worried. The little one's sick, was all she said. On his screen, Marcus Webb, his attorney, was speaking, his voice tinny through the speakers. Ashford, the board needs to hear from you directly. The motion on the table is regarding interim leadership. We need to know your capacity to engage. Ashford looked at the faces. Some were concerned, some were impatient. One or two he knew were poised to take what he had built. The old version of him would have felt a surge of defensive anger. The man who had been sitting by the window for 2 years felt only a hollow tiredness. And then he thought of Lena's question by the stone bench. You miss her? He thought of the small, warm hand in his. He leaned toward the microphone. My capacity, he said, his voice clearer than he expected, is not your concern. The company's performance is. Pull up the Q1 projections. There was a beat of stunned silence. Then figures flashed on the shared screen. For the next 27 minutes, Ashford Crane did what he had not done in over a year. He led. He questioned numbers. He pointed out a flaw in the marketing timeline. His voice gained strength, not from anger, but from a focus that had been buried under layers of grief and isolation. He was rusty, but he was present. The board members shifted in their seats. The momentum of the meeting changed. When the vote was called, the motion for an interim CEO failed, 7-5. He had kept his company, but as the boxes on the screen went dark one by one, he felt not triumph, but a new, sharper worry. He wheeled himself out to the kitchen. Mrs. Patton was there. What's wrong with Lena? He asked. High fever. Laura's beside herself. Can't afford a doctor, won't say it, but it's true. Ashford didn't reply. He went to the study, picked up the phone, and called Dr. Reyes, not for himself, for a child with a stuffed rabbit. 30 minutes later, Dr. Reyes was at Laura's apartment, a place Ashford had never seen and could hardly imagine. The diagnosis was a severe ear infection, easily treatable with antibiotics, but painful and frightening for a small child. Dr. Reyes called Ashford from the apartment. She'll be fine. But the mother, she's exhausted. And this apartment is. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That afternoon, Ashford did something else he had not done in 2 years. He gave Mrs. Patton a list of groceries, specific items, children's medicine, orange juice, soup, crackers. He had her pack them into a box. Then he told her to take the estate car and deliver it. When Laura opened her door to Mrs. Patton holding a box of supplies, she started to cry. Silent, shaking tears of relief and humiliation and gratitude all mixed together. Mrs. Patton just walked in, put the soup on the stove, and started tidying up. He asked about her, Mrs. Patton said softly as she folded a blanket. Sent the doctor, sent this, he's different. Laura could only nod. The next day, Lena's fever broke. Laura came back to work on Friday, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. She walked into the kitchen to find Ashford at the table, a sealed envelope beside his coffee cup. Sit down, Laura, he said. It wasn't a request. She sat, her hands in her lap. He pushed the envelope toward her. Open it. Inside was not cash. It was a formal job offer letter, a new position, household manager and primary care assistant. The salary was triple what she made as a housekeeper. It included health insurance. For her and for Lena, it outlined paid days off. It was professional, legal, binding. Laura read it twice, the words blurring. I don't have those qualifications, she whispered. You have the only ones that matter, Ashford said. He was looking out at the garden. You showed up, and you brought her. He had also, she would learn later that day, called his property management company. He owned several buildings across the city. He had instructed them to cancel the rent increase at Laura's address, not to give her a free ride, her new salary could cover it, but to undo the pressure that had been crushing her. It was a quiet, behind-the-scenes fix, the kind he used to be famous for. The change in the house after that was not dramatic. It was deep, it was structural. Laura's title changed, her routine changed. She now coordinated Ashford's therapy appointments, managed the other part-time staff, and yes, still cleaned because she insisted on it. She had a proper contract, benefits, a future she could plan for. Lena recovered fully. Her visits to the study became part of the daily schedule. She would arrive after breakfast, often with a new drawing. Ashford pinned every single one to the corkboard, which soon became a riot of crayon circles and stick figures. He bought her proper art supplies. He never called it a gift. He called it office supplies for the resident artist. The garden door stayed unlocked. Spring turned to early summer. The rose bushes that Claire had planted and that Ashford had ignored for years began to bloom. One morning, Mrs. Patton cut 3 of the deepest red roses and put them in a vase in the dining room. Lena tried to smell them and got a petal stuck on her nose, which she declared a great triumph. Ashford began to work regular hours. The hum of business, of life, slowly returned to the house. He started a video call with his senior team every Monday. He was quieter than the old Ashford, more deliberate, but he was back. One afternoon in June, Laura was in the study, delivering the mail. Ashford was at his desk. He finished a call and wheeled around to face her. I'm setting up a foundation, he said abruptly, for caregivers, for people who do what you did, who show up when the professionals leave. Laura just looked at him. The paperwork is being drawn up. It will offer grants, respite care, training. He paused. I'm namming it after Claire. Laura felt her throat tighten. She simply nodded. That was the final, surprising turn. The man who had pushed the world away was now using his resources to build a support system for others living in the same lonely valley he had occupied. His grief was not gone. His paralysis was not healed, but his isolation had been broken. There is a kind of healing that doesn't make headlines. It doesn't come from a miracle cure or a dramatic moment. It comes from a series of small, stubborn acts of connection, a bandage with cartoon stars, a drawing of 2 circles, a question asked in a garden, a job offer in an envelope, a rose cut and brought inside. Ashford never walked again, but he began to live again. He and Lena developed a strange and beautiful friendship. She taught him the names of all her stuffed animals. He taught her how to play chess, moving the pieces for her as she commanded from his lap. She called him Ash, and he never corrected her. Laura found a stability she had never known. The spring in the sofa mattress was replaced. Lena got new shoes, and then shoes after those. The counted minutes of her morning routine loosened, became minutes she could spend watching her daughter sleep. The house became a home, not a perfect one, not a traditional one, but a place where broken people figured out how to be less broken together. It was a family built not from blood or paperwork, but from showing up. Stubbornly, repeatedly, with a stuffed rabbit and no concept of the word impossible. The story doesn't end with a neat bow. Real ones never do. But in that house, with the garden in bloom and the study door open and the sound of a little girl's laughter drifting down the hall, it felt, finally, like something true was beginning. And that brings us to the real question this story leaves us with. So what is the real question this story leaves us with? Perhaps it's this. In a world that often values professional credentials over pure human connection, who holds the real power to heal? The experts had the training, the protocols, the right answers, but they saw a diagnosis, a difficult client, a liability. Lena, a 4-year-old, saw a sad man. She didn't see paralysis or wealth or a list of rules. She saw a person sitting alone and she reached for his hand. That was her entire methodology, and it worked. We spend so much of our lives building walls, walls of professionalism, of privacy, of self-protection. We believe strength means being impenetrable, but this story whispers a dangerous, beautiful truth. Sometimes strength is found in the cracked open places, in the willingness to let a child put a cartoon bandage on your hand and believe, for a moment, that it can make things all better. Ashford Crane had everything money could buy, and it meant nothing in the face of his grief and isolation. Laura Chin had almost nothing, but she had a stubborn kindness that became the bridge he needed to cross back into the world. And Lena, she had no power at all, except the terrifying, wonderful power of not knowing what was impossible. This isn't just a story about a millionaire and a nanny. It's a mirror. Who in your life is sitting by a window, staring at a garden they no longer visit? Who is carrying a weight they don't have the hands for? And who might you be overlooking? The quiet person in the background, the unexpected child, the one without the right title, who holds the key to a door you've kept locked. The quiet moments are the ones that change everything. The bandage with the stars, the drawing of 2 circles, the question asked in a garden. They almost never make the news, but they are the fabric of our humanity. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of a time someone saw you when you felt invisible, or a time you reached for someone who seemed beyond reach, then you understand why we tell these stories. This channel is for that, for the quiet, true moments that remind us what we're capable of. We don't shout here, we don't chase the loudest trends, we sit with the stories that are worth staying for, the ones that have weight and heart and something real to say about how we survive and how we heal. If you want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss the next one. And if you're willing, leave a comment below. Tell us about a moment when a small, unexpected kindness changed your day or your life. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for listening, for staying, for believing in the quiet power of a hand held, a door opened, a life begun again. There are so many more stories worth staying for. We'll see you in the next